Keep your 2 women, Calloway, but not my water." That threat from Wade Kearny changed everything for the 3 of us, though it would take a full year and a fight I nearly lost to prove exactly how much. He said it to my face on a hot July afternoon, sitting his horse in my own dooryard like a man come to collect on something he already believed was owed him. And by the time he wheeled that horse and rode off my land, I understood something I hadn't let myself admit until that moment. I would lose the herd, the graze, the water, maybe the whole 500 acres my dead partner and I had carved out of raw desert ground with our own 2 hands before I would hand over 2 Apache women my own kind had already cast out once, for no crime greater than a body that would not give a husband a child. I'm getting ahead of the story, though, and a story worth telling deserves to be told the way it actually happened, start to finish, so you understand exactly what it cost and exactly what it turned out to be worth. Let me take you back instead to the morning I first found them, because that's where all of this genuinely begins, on a fence line. In a wind cold enough to crack the skin on a man's knuckles, with 2 horses walking slower than any horse ever walks, when the women riding them carry no real certainty that anything good waits at the other end of the road. 9 years I had worked this ground in the Arizona Territory, high desert grass country, wedged between 2 mountain ranges, with more open sky overhead than any one man rightly knows what to do with. For 6 of those 9 years I'd had a partner beside me, a raw-boned Missouri man named Amos Teague, who'd come west with nothing to his name but a saddle, a bad temper, and a work ethic that put mine to shame most mornings. Over the better part of a decade he'd turned into the closest thing to family I had left in this world. Together we built the place plank by plank and post by post, 520 acres all told, near 240 of it good graze. A thick adobe house with walls 2 feet through that kept the summer heat out and the winter cold in equal measure. A barn we'd raised with our own hands in 11 straight days. A tack shed that always smelled of neat's foot oil and dust, and a bunkhouse I never once had the spare money to put a hired man inside of. Amos took a fever in the spring 4 years back and was gone inside of 9 days, and left me the whole outfit, every acre, every one of the 110 cattle we ran together, every dollar of debt we still owed the bank down in Tucson, with nobody left to talk to over supper but the sound of my own boots crossing an empty floor. I want to be honest with you about what that kind of solitude does to a man, because it isn't dramatic. It's slow. It doesn't break you all at once, the way a bad storm breaks a fence line. It wears you down the way running water wears a stone, so gradual you don't notice the shape of yourself changing until one morning you catch your reflection in the water bucket and don't quite recognize the man staring back, or you find yourself talking out loud to a horse just to hear a human voice cross the yard that isn't only the wind coming down off the ridge. I'd gotten used to eating standing at the stove, plate balanced on one forearm. I'd gotten used to not lighting the second lamp, because there was nobody else in the house to need the light of it. And oil cost money a lonely man could save. I told myself I preferred it that way. The way a man tells himself a great many comfortable, convenient things, once there's nobody left around to argue him out of them. This country asks a great deal of anyone who tries to make a living from it. Summer runs from May clear through September some years, the heat pressing down on the grass until it goes the color of old rope, and a man learns to do his hardest work before 8 in the morning or after 6 at night, or not at all. Winter comes down off the 2 ranges, quick and mean, sometimes inside a single week, turning that same rope-colored grass brittle and white with frost before a rancher has properly finished his fall gathering. Between those 2 seasons sits a spring worth almost any hardship to see arrive. Wildflowers pushing up through ground that looked dead as ash a month before, the cattle putting on flesh again after a hard winter, the whole valley green for 6 short weeks before the heat rolls back in. Amos used to reckon a man could measure everything worth knowing about his own character by which of those 3 seasons he dreaded most, and by that measure I'd always counted myself a summer man, patient with heat, less patient with cold and the long empty nights it brought with it. The nearest town of any real size sat the better part of a day's ride south, which suited me fine most years, and suited me considerably less well in the 4 years after Amos died, when a day's ride to town was often the only conversation I'd have with another living soul between one Sunday and the next. I kept the place running because there wasn't any other choice a man in my position could reasonably make. The bank in Tucson held paper on half the equipment, and letting the herd go to seed wasn't a decision so much as simply what happened to a place nobody tended anymore. So I tended it, alone, and then before too much longer, not alone at all. The morning it all changed. I was out at first light mending a stretch of the north fence where the hard frost had heaved 6 posts clean out of the ground overnight. The kind of thankless chore that eats a whole day of a man's life and leaves nothing to show for it but sore hands and a fence line that looks, come sundown, exactly like it did at sun-up. I heard the horses a long while before I ever laid eyes on them, that particular slow and deliberate walk of an animal that's carried someone a great distance already, ridden by a rider in no real hurry to arrive anywhere, because arriving only means finding out whether there's anything left waiting on the other end worth the trouble of the ride at all. They stopped 20 yards off my fence line, and I straightened up with the rail still in one hand, sweat already freezing at the back of my collar, and I had myself a good long look. 2 Apache women, somewhere in their middle 20s by my best guess, each with a bedroll lashed behind her saddle and precious little else that I could make out, no wagon trailing along behind, no supplies packed for any real distance, no man riding escort at either shoulder. The one sitting forward held herself straight-backed on a sturdy bay gelding, dark eyes moving over my fence, my barn, the whole shape of my spread, with the quick, careful appraisal of a person deciding on the spot whether a place could actually be survived in through a winter. The second woman held back half a length behind her, quieter, her attention gone somewhere past me entirely, fixed instead on the gray gelding working the near pasture. She watched that horse the way another person watches a fire on a bitter night, close and careful and just a little bit hungry for it. The frost still clung silver to the fence wire between us, and neither woman moved to close that 20 yards until I did first, setting the rail down and stepping toward them with my hands loose and visible at my sides, the way I'd want a stranger to approach me if our positions were reversed. Their tack was good leather, gone dry from a long ride without proper oiling, saddlebags flat and near empty, and both horses carried the lean, hard-used look of animals that had covered more ground lately than any horse ought to without a rest day built into the schedule. Neither woman wore anything that marked her as desperate exactly. Their clothes were clean, mended carefully at the seams, boots cared for despite the miles on them. But there's a particular stillness to a person who has run clean out of easy options, a kind of careful economy in how they hold themselves, and I recognized it the moment I looked past the horses to the two faces above them. It isn't a look a man forgets once he's seen it clearly, because I'd worn something close to it myself in the weeks right after Amos died, when I hadn't yet worked out how a single person was meant to run an outfit built for two. The wind had come up hard enough by then that loose strands of hair whipped free of both women's braids, and the quieter one, the one who couldn't leave off watching my gray gelding, pulled her collar higher against it without once looking away from the horse. I remember thinking, even before I knew either of their names, that whatever brought two capable women to a stranger's fence line in weather like that had to run serious enough that pride wasn't going to be much use to any of us in the conversation about to follow. We heard a man out this way was running a big place alone, the taller one said, her English clean and unhurried, better than I'd braced myself for. We can cook. We can mend a shirt or a harness so the stitching outlasts the cloth around it. And we know horses better than most men who'll stand in front of you and swear that they do. She tipped her chin, not unkindly, toward the quieter woman beside her, and I understood without being told outright that the horse knowledge belonged mostly to her. We are not asking for charity, and we are not asking for wages. Room and food for work worth a good deal more than either, until we know what comes next for us. I told her plain that I didn't have much past a roof and 3 meals to offer anybody. She looked at me a long, level moment, weighing that answer the way a person weighs a coin they suspect might be light, and gave back the truest thing I'd hear all year. What they had right now was less than that. I looked past her at the second woman's face, still fixed on my gray gelding, at the frost whitening both their coat collars, and I found I didn't have it in me to send 2 capable women back out into that wind on the strength of pride alone, mine or theirs. Come up to the house, I told them. Get warm before we talk terms in earnest. Her name was Sikya. The quieter one, the one who couldn't keep her eyes off my horses even over a cup of coffee at my own kitchen table, was Winona. Not blood sisters, they told me, but raised up together inside the same small band in the Dattel foothills, close enough as sisters that the distinction hardly seemed worth drawing between them any more. Over that first pot of coffee, I asked plainly what had brought 2 capable women to my fence line with nothing but a bedroll apiece, because I figured a man ought to know exactly who he was inviting under his own roof before he handed over a key to it. Sikya's answer came unflinching, direct, in a way I would come to learn was simply how she carried herself through the world, regardless of the weight of the subject. Both of them had been married inside their own band, and both marriages had ended the same way, months apart, because neither woman had been able to give her husband a child. There was no self-pity dressing up the words when she told it. A band that lived hard against a hostile country needed children to carry it forward into the next lean winter. A woman who could not bear them became in the fearful reckoning of people scared for their own survival. A problem that solved itself by being quietly set aside. Her own husband had put her away first. Winona's had done the same thing not 4 months later. They'd chosen to leave together rather than travel their separate directions after, away from anywhere neither of them was wanted anymore. Winona, across the table, only nodded once at that, her eyes gone somewhere distant out the window, and didn't add a word of her own to it, though her hands stayed wrapped tight around her coffee cup the whole while. I'd read enough by then to know that some bands weighed things differently than others, and that Sikya's telling wasn't bitterness dressed up as fact. She carried no real anger toward either man, only a plain accounting of a hard choice a hard country had forced onto people trying their best to survive it. I didn't press either woman for more than they offered freely that first morning. Some grief a person only hands over in pieces, on their own timetable, and I'd learned that lesson myself in the 4 years since Amos died. What struck me most in those early weeks wasn't the hardship in their history. I'd have believed hardship of just about anyone who rode up out of that country with nothing but a bedroll. It was the plain skill underneath everything they did. Skill that had nothing to do with the reason either of them had been sent away. Sikya could take a length of buckskin and a bundle of sinew and produce stitching finer than anything I'd ever paid a saddler in town good money for, work she'd learned, in passing, from her own mother, who had learned it from hers before that, a whole unbroken line of women's hands reaching back further than either of us could easily count. Winona's gift with horses wasn't some mysterious talent that arrived out of nowhere either. It was the plain result of a childhood spent around animals her people had always kept and bred and depended on. Patience taught early and practiced daily, until it stopped looking like a skill at all and started looking like simple nature. I'd grown up around men who assumed a certain kind of ignorance in anybody who didn't look and worship the way they did, and it took me embarrassingly little time living alongside these two women to understand exactly how wrong that assumption had always been, and how much poorer an outfit I'd been running without the competence they'd walked onto my land, already carrying with them. They kept their own ways in the bunkhouse without any need for my permission. A small woven basket Sikya set by the door, certain foods prepared certain ways on certain mornings. Words passed between the two of them in their own language that I never once pressed either woman to translate for my benefit, because it plainly wasn't mine to ask for. I came to understand, watching them those first months, that dignity isn't a thing a man like me hands out to people like a wage. It's a thing people carry with them regardless of what any of the rest of us think we're generously giving them. And the only real choice in front of me was whether I'd have the sense to notice it. If this slow-built story is why you keep coming back, I'd ask something small of you. Tap join beside the channel name and become a member. It costs nothing extra, and it keeps these stories coming. I gave them the bunkhouse that same afternoon, swept out and aired for the first time since Amos died. A stove of its own laid and lit against the cold. They kept their space. I kept mine. We took breakfast together most mornings, more out of plain practical sense than anything grander. One fire to build, one pot of coffee to boil, instead of two separate households pretending at solitude under one roof. Inside a week I understood I'd struck the better end of the bargain by a wide margin. Winona had a way with horses I had genuinely never encountered in 9 years of ranching this ground. Not tricks, nothing showy for an audience, just a stillness in her hands and her low, even voice that settled a nervous animal the way a steady hand settles a frightened child. My gray gelding, who'd fought every rider ever to climb onto his back, myself included on my worst mornings, stood for her inside 3 days like he'd been born gentle as a lamb. Sikya, meanwhile, turned out to be a fine cook, a finer mender, and this part surprised me most of all. Every bit as capable a hand with cattle as any drover I'd ever hired and lost again to better wages down the valley. The rhythm of the place changed with them in ways I hadn't expected and wouldn't have known how to ask for. Mornings started earlier and somehow felt less long. Sikya kept a garden bed going behind the bunkhouse that first spring, small at first. Beans and squash and a row of chiles that did better in our dry ground than I'd ever managed on my own attempts years back. And she traded vegetables to a rancher's wife 2 sections over for fabric and needles, building up her own small store of goods through nothing but steady, patient effort. Winona took over the horse string entirely inside the first month, and the change in those animals was plain to anyone who rode out to my place. Even my hard-mouthed roan, a horse I'd nearly given up training years before, came around to her handling with a willingness he'd never once shown me. Evenings the 3 of us fell into an easy enough routine. Supper together, sometimes quiet, sometimes not. The 2 women trading news in their own tongue while I worked leather by the lamp, all 3 of us glad, I think, of simply having other people in the house at night, whatever else any of us were or weren't yet willing to put into words about it. By midsummer that first year, I'd stopped keeping precise track of the days the way I had those lonely 4 years alone, because a place with 3 people in it marks time differently than a place with 1, by chores finished together, by meals shared, by small private jokes that grow up between people working the same ground day after day, rather than by the bare, aching count of empty suppers a solitary man keeps without meaning to. I saw the truth of that last part for myself not 2 weeks later, when a dry lightning storm rolling in over the ridge spooked a good third of my herd into a run toward a wash cut deep enough to break legs and necks both. I was a 1/4 mile off, and knew I'd never close that distance in time. Sikya was closer, mounted on the old sorrel mare, and she cut into the lead of that running herd at an angle I wouldn't have dared myself, talking low and steady the whole way, turning the leaders just enough that the whole panicked mass bent around the wash instead of into it. By the time I reached her, she had the herd milling in a loose, settling circle, her braid come half undone across one shoulder, breathing hard but entirely unshaken, like a woman who'd done exactly that kind of work her whole life and saw no particular reason to make a show of having done it well. I've worked cattle the better part of my adult life, and I've seen good hands turn a running herd before, but there was something in how Sikya read that herd's whole shape at a dead run, which cow was fixing to break left, which 3 head were about to panic the rest into the wash, that I couldn't have taught a man in a year of trying. She never brought it up again after that afternoon, went back to the kitchen that same evening, and had supper on the table like nothing worth remarking on had happened at all. And it was only later, lying awake, that I understood how easily that same afternoon could have cost me a third of my herd, if she hadn't been exactly where she was, doing exactly what she did. Word travels fast in a county this size, faster than a man would ever like, and it wasn't but 3 weeks after that before it reached the ears of my nearest neighbor to the northeast, a big rancher named Wade Kearny, who ran twice the cattle I did on ground twice the size, and who had been after my water right for the better part of 4 years, with 2 insultingly low offers, both of which I'd turned down flat without a second thought. Kearny rode out to my place on a scorching afternoon with 2 of his hands flanking him, and he stayed mounted through the entire exchange, looking down at me from the saddle the way a man looks down at something he's already decided is beneath his notice. He'd heard, he told me, that I'd taken in a couple of squaws, and that this county didn't much care for that kind of arrangement, and neither did he, and he'd think a man in my position would want to keep his neighbors thinking well of him. I looked up at him a long moment before I answered, the sun hot on the back of my own neck, and I meant every word that came out of my mouth. This was my land, I told him, and they were my people, and what happened on this ground was my business and not his. If he had a complaint with that, he was welcome to ride back the direction he'd come from, and keep riding. He didn't say another word back. He turned his horse and rode off in a hard trot, and that was the exact moment he made the threat that opened this story, though it would be nearly another full year before he made good on any of it in a way that could genuinely hurt me. That night I told Sikya and Winona what had passed at the fence, because I figured they had a right to know a man in this county had marked them for trouble simply for existing under my roof. Sikya set down the mending in her lap and studied me a long moment. Did I mean that, she wanted to know, that they were my people? I told her I supposed I did, that it had come out of my mouth before I'd even thought to weigh it first, which told me something true about how I'd already come to see the matter without ever consciously deciding to. She nodded once, satisfied, and went back to her stitching without another word on it. Winona, though, hadn't said anything through any of that exchange, standing back near the window with her arms folded, watching me across the lamplight with a careful, measuring attention I couldn't yet put a proper name to. A hard winter came down on us early that year, colder than any I'd known on this piece of ground in 9 seasons of working it, and it tested every seam of the outfit we'd built. One night, with the temperature down near 4 degrees and the wind driving snow sideways hard enough to sting a man's exposed face raw, Winona came awake sudden in the bunkhouse, certain in her bones that a heavy cow out in the birthing pen was about to labor badly and needed help before dawn found her dead in the frozen mud. She was in the barn with a lantern lit before I even had my boots laced up. Sleeve already rolled to the shoulder, her voice low and even against the animal's heaving flank. Working a breech calf into the world by feel and patience alone while I held the lantern high, and did precious little of any real use besides that. We brought a live calf into that freezing night together, steam rising thick off its wet hide in the lamplight, its first shaky ball swallowed almost whole by the wind outside the barn walls, and Winona sat back on her heels afterward with blood dried on her forearm and something close to joy lighting her whole face, an expression I hadn't seen there once before, not in the 2 months she'd been living under my roof. We named that calf later. In the offhand way ranch animals sometimes earn names they were never going to officially need. Sikya took one look at the little heifer's face, still damp and wobbling on legs too long for her body, and decided the calf would carry a word from their own language meaning something close to stubborn, on account of how hard she'd fought her way into a world that near killed her getting there. That calf grew up favoring Winona above every other creature on the place, trailing her across the yard the way a dog might. And I'd catch Winona sometimes standing at the pasture fence in the evening with that same heifer's head resting against her shoulder, both of them entirely still, like two creatures who'd decided, independent of anybody else's opinion on the matter, that they belonged to each other now. Over that same long winter, Sikya told me their story in pieces, the unhurried way a person only tells you the truth about themselves when the telling doesn't cost too much all at once. Her band had been a small one, pushed north and east out of the Datil country by pressures neither of us needed to name plainly at my own kitchen table for the shame of it. The men they'd married had been good men, by her own account, and she carried no real anger toward either of them even now. The band's reasoning had been the band's reasoning. Hard as it was on the women who bore the weight of it, and she'd made her peace with the matter long before she ever rode up to my fence line looking for work. I learned about Winona's own marriage sideways, almost by accident, one evening while she mended a length of tack I'd botched a repair on myself and left in the shed for weeks out of pure avoidance. He'd never had the patience, she said quietly of her husband, not looking up from the leather in her lap, for anything that took real time to do right. I understood she meant it kindly and cruelly both at once, that he had been decent to her in nearly every way. But the one thing that mattered most to a man in his position, and that she had wanted children every bit as badly as he had, which made the losing of that marriage the hardest single thing she'd carried out of her old life and into mine. For what it was worth, I told her, I thought he'd been a fool. She didn't answer that directly, but I caught the corner of her mouth pull just barely, toward something that wasn't quite a smile yet, and wasn't quite not one either. Spring came late and mean that year, and Kearny made his second real move against me before the thaw had properly finished off the last of the snow in the high draws. He leaned on the county suppliers I depended on for spring restock, seed, fence wire, feed grain, until 2 of the 3 quietly closed their doors to my business without ever offering me a straight reason why, the silence itself telling me everything I needed to understand about where the pressure had come from. Sikya was the one who saw the actual shape of it clearest. She sat me down at my own table one evening and asked, cool as still water in a deep well, exactly which men left in the county hadn't yet fallen in line behind Kearny's money, and which of those men might carry their own private grievance against him worth putting to use. Her clear, cold-eyed reasoning in that single conversation did more real good for me than a month of my own stubborn stewing and cussing had managed on my own. That question led me straight to a neighbor, 2 sections over named Ezra Colton, a stubborn, decent rancher who'd been feuding with Kearny over a stretch of shared water
for going on 6 years running, and the two of us struck a plan together, a joint spring cattle drive clear out to the rail buyers on the Rio Grande, bypassing the county suppliers Kearny had strangled off entirely, splitting the cost of the drive and the profit at the far end evenly between us. It was a plan built on nothing but two stubborn men's shared refusal to be starved out of a county either of us had bled for.
Kearny answered that alliance by calling in a debt against me I hadn't even known he owned. $310 on old equipment paper he'd quietly bought up from a supplier in town, due in full inside 2 short weeks, plainly meant to force me into selling stock at a ruinous loss or losing the equipment outright. That evening, Sikya came to me carrying a folded cloth bundle I'd never seen before, and inside it lay every piece of silver and gold jewelry she and Winona owned between them, the last real valuables either woman still carried out of their old life. It wasn't charity, she told me, before I could open my mouth to refuse it. It was what they owed me. I had fed them through a winter that would have killed them both alone, and I had stood between them and men who would have made their lives considerably worse than merely hard. "Take it," she said, and meant it. I was moved past any words I had ready for that particular moment. But I found another way through instead. A short-term note against next season's calf crop, signed at the bank in town 2 days later. And I didn't take the silver, though I understood exactly what that offer had cost the two of them to make in the first place. Sikya only shrugged when I handed the bundle back to her still closed. They'd been keeping those pieces, she said, for another life, the life they'd once believed they were going to have. It was better, she thought, to finally put that old life down for good and stop carrying its weight around on their backs. If a story like theirs keeps you watching to the end, consider becoming a member of this channel. Tap join beside the name. It was late in March, evening light going long and gold across the pasture grass. When Winona rode up alongside me at a stretch of fence we'd just finished mending together, side by side, without either of us needing to say much about the work at all. "This was good land," she said, looking out over it rather than at me, and she wondered whether I ever thought about leaving it behind. I told her the truth, that I didn't, not anymore, and that most nights lately I found myself thinking instead about what this exact place would look like in 10 years, and who might be standing on it beside me to see it through. She went quiet a long moment at that, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had gone soft in a way I hadn't heard from her before, not once. They would stay, she said, if they could. I told her there wasn't a single reason in this territory that she couldn't. Something eased between the two of us after that evening at the fence, a tension I hadn't fully realized I'd been carrying until it started to loosen. We took to riding out together most evenings after that, checking stock, mending the small breaks a fence line always develops between one season and the next, and the silences between us stopped feeling like the careful, watchful quiet of two strangers sharing a roof out of necessity, and started feeling like the easy quiet of two people who'd simply run out of any pressing need to fill every minute with talk. Sikya noticed the change in both of us before either Winona or I fully admitted it to ourselves. She took to finding small reasons to leave the two of us alone with the evening chores, a plate that needed washing suddenly urgent, a seam that suddenly couldn't wait until morning, and neither Winona nor I ever pointed out the transparency of it, because we were both, in our own quiet ways, grateful for the room she kept making for us without either of us having to ask for it directly. Sikya told me something not long after that, in her plain and unhurried way, that I've carried with me ever since. Winona watched me, she said, when she believed I didn't know she was watching. She wasn't a woman who said things she didn't mean. She never had been, not once in all the years Sikya had known her. I didn't have a ready answer for that, so I said nothing back and went on with my work, though I noticed my own hands weren't entirely steady on the fence wire for a good while afterward. It was an August night, hot and still, crickets loud through the open kitchen window, when Winona spoke my name across the table the slow way a person tests the weight of something before deciding whether they trust it to hold. When they'd first ridden up to my fence, she told me, she had already put away the part of herself that wanted things that could be taken from her all over again. She hadn't let herself want much of anything, not after the last time it had cost her so dearly. She hadn't expected to feel the way she felt now, like she was somewhere she was meant to be, like she was sitting across from someone who actually saw her, and not merely the use of her two capable hands around a place that needed them. I set my hand flat on the table between us, not reaching, only offering, and she laid her own hand over mine without a moment's hesitation, and neither of us said another word for a long while after that, because there wasn't a thing left worth saying that our two hands together hadn't already said plainer than either of us could have managed out loud. Kearny's last move against me came dressed up as something almost legal, which made it considerably more dangerous than any threat he'd ever made with his own mouth. He filed a claim down at the county land office arguing my water right had been improperly recorded years back, before my time on this ground, back when Amos first staked the original claim, a technicality thin as the paper it was written on. But paper is exactly the kind of weapon that can beat a man who spent his whole life fighting with his hands instead of with lawyers and clerks. I was tired of bending to Wade Kearny by then, tired clean down to the bone of it, and I fought the claim rather than folding under it, filing every counter-document the land office would accept from me, riding to Tucson twice inside 3 weeks to press my case in person before men who'd never once set foot on my ground. The spring drive with Ezra Colton went off clean, while that fight was still hanging in the balance, nearly 400 head pushed across hard open country toward the rail buyers waiting on the Rio Grande, dust rising gold in the late light behind the herd for 3 straight days. Winona riding dragged the entire distance with a steadiness that put every one of my hired hands to open shame, Sikya keeping the books and the provisions tight enough that we came home from that drive with real coin in hand for the first time in going on 2 years. 3 days out from home, we pushed that herd across the San Pedro at a shallow ford Ezra knew from years of running this same country, 400 head fording chest-deep water in a long, bawling line, while riders held position on both flanks to keep the current from scattering them downstream. Winona held the upstream flank the whole crossing, her horse fighting the pull of the water gamely beneath her, and she never once let a single head drift more than a few yards off the line the whole hour it took to get the herd across.
Nights on that drive we made camp under more stars than a man ever properly notices from the comfort of his own porch. The fire built low against the wind, and there was a kind of easy quiet between all of us. On that trail I hadn't felt in the whole 4 years since Amos passed. The particular contentment of hard, honest work shared out fairly among people who trust each other to carry their portion of it without complaint. Ezra's hands took to Winona and Sikya inside the first day, the way good cow hands generally take to anybody who can flat out do the job better than half the men drawing wages for it. And by the third night out, nobody on that drive gave much thought to who was Apache and who wasn't, only to who could hold a line at a river crossing and who couldn't. We came down out of the last dry stretch onto the rail buyers' pens at Rio Grande on the 5th morning. Dust and cattle and the particular relief of a long drive nearly finished, and the buyer there paid fair money for 400 head in better condition than most drives arrived in, on account of the steady, careful handling all along the trail. I split that money square with Ezra Colton the way we'd agreed at the start, and rode home 3 days later with more real cash in my saddlebags than I'd carried in 2 years running, and a debt to Wade Kearny that I could finally clear outright, in full, the very week I got back.
Sikya had told me the week before we rode out that I'd win the water fight in the end, plain as she'd tell me the weather coming in off the ridge. It was because I didn't stop, she said. She'd watched me not stop at every other hard thing since the morning we first met at my fence line, and she saw no earthly reason the water would turn out any different in the end. The county official ruled inside a month of the drive's return. My water right stood exactly as it had always been recorded, valid and unbroken clear back to Amos's original claim, and Kearny's filing was dismissed outright, the whole scheme having cost him considerably more in county goodwill than it ever could have won him in water rights. Word of the ruling beat me home from Tucson by nearly a full day, the way news of a man's business always seems to travel faster than the man himself on a tired horse, and I came back onto my own land to find Sikya already had a supper laid that was closer to a celebration than an ordinary Tuesday evening deserved, and Winona standing at the corral fence with that stubborn little heifer-turned yearling pressed against the rail beside her, watching the road for my dust, the same patient way she watched everything else worth watching on this place. Wade Kearny, so far as I ever heard, never crossed our shared fence line again, which suited every one of us just fine. There are some neighbors a man is better off simply not needing anything further from, and I'd learned by then that his opinion of my household had never actually cost me a single thing worth keeping in the first place. Ezra Colton and I ran that joint drive again the following spring, and the one after that, and it grew into the kind of standing arrangement two stubborn men build. Once they've proven to each other they can be trusted with the other's cattle and the other's word in equal measure. Sikya's garden grew a full row longer each year I kept count of it, and by the third spring she was trading preserves and dried chilies as far as 2 counties over, known by name in 3 separate towns, before I ever thought to ask her whether that kind of recognition mattered to her the way it might have mattered to me. The seasons stacked up easy after that, one on top of the next, in the particular way years pass for people who've finally stopped bracing themselves against whatever's coming next. Another calf crop,
Another spring drive, another hard winter survived a little easier than the one before it because the three of us had long since learned exactly how to carry a hard winter together, instead of each carrying a separate share of it alone. The bunkhouse stopped being a separate household in anything but name somewhere along the way, though nobody ever formally decided to change the arrangement. It simply happened, the way most true things on this piece of ground had a habit of happening, slow and steady, and without any single afternoon a person could point to as the turning point.
The winter that followed was a milder one, kinder to the herd, and kinder to all three of us in equal measure. The calf Winona had pulled into the world in that freezing barn 2 winters back had grown into a strong, healthy yearling by then, and the whole herd around it stood fat and thriving, going into the cold months for the first time since I'd lost Amos. Sikya spent those shorter days planning out a spring garden bigger than anything either of us had ever bothered with before, sketching neat rows onto a scrap of paper at the kitchen table like a woman planning for a good many years, still ahead of her on this exact piece of ground, not a season or 2 borrowed against uncertainty. One evening, near the tail end of that milder winter, Winona and I rode the whole fence line together, checking every post and every strand of wire the way we'd done together so many times by then, that it had long since stopped feeling like work and started feeling like something closer to a habit 2 people keep because they genuinely want to, not because the ranch demands it of them. We put the horses up together in the last of the light, unhurried, and came back out of the barn to a sky gone deep purple and burnt orange over the western ridge, the kind of evening sky that stops a person cold and makes them simply look at it a while before going on with anything else. Winona put her hand into mine, easy and unhurried, the way a person does a thing she knows she's finally earned the right to do and no longer needs anyone's permission for. My land stretched out in front of the 2 of us in that fading light, my fence line running true clear to the ridge, my cattle grazing quiet and fat in the near pasture, my house with smoke curling steady from the chimney, and Sikya's lamp already lit and glowing gold in the kitchen window. And beside me, a good woman who had ridden up to my fence with nothing in this world but a bedroll and a name, and who had chosen every single day since that cold morning to stay. Wade Kearny had told me once he'd take the water before he'd let 2 rejected women keep a roof on my land. He never got a drop of it. He never got either woman off my ground either, and he never would. That's the whole of it, when you get right down to the bottom of the matter. 2 women my own people called worthless for a thing that was never any fault of their own, and a lonely rancher who needed exactly what they had to give a great deal more than he ever needed what most men in this territory would call a proper reason to take them in. That's the whole of it. And I'll tell you plainly, for the 3 of us, on this piece of ground, under that same purple and orange sky most evenings now, it has always, and will always, be enough.